Hello. I have these set now to record automatically, so that way I don't forget. So we are good. We're already recording, and maybe I can cut some of the early stuff off.
That's good thinking. Good thinking.
But when I had to resend the Zoom invite with the dial-in, I saw this little checkbox for that. And I was like, oh. So I was glad I noticed that. Let's see here. I also took off the waiting room. That way I wasn't having to monitor that. Okay. Sometimes I get things right. Usually the second, third, fourth, fifth time around, but. Okay. Looks like there's still a few more to chime in, so we'll give it one more minute and get going. So welcome everybody. I hope you're having a good week and looking forward to the week's end. Shannon, yes. Me too. I think really the 4-day work week is something we ought to investigate.
I don't know about that there, Trisha. Because there's going to be work for us to do more, right? The amount of work doesn't go away.
This is true.
There's promising research on it, though, that there's like a not really much of a reduction in productivity.
Right.
I'm the same, like, there haven't been all of the studies that we might want, though.
I think you're right. I haven't read them, but I know Diane has alluded to them in some of the research that supports it. I can't imagine getting HR to go for that. Okay, so I think most of us are here. So again, welcome. I've set this to record right when we come in, so that way I don't have to remember, since I typically forget because I get so excited to get started. So welcome. Hopefully you had a chance to look at the pre-work videos. One was on the FAR and the other was on grants versus contracts. If you didn't, you have those there as a reference. So I'm going to go ahead and pull up the slides. You all have the handouts. I've added in a couple things. I always am tinkering around, so I may have added a couple things in that you don't have on your handouts. I also corrected a very egregious spelling error of publicly, so sorry about that. On your handouts, but we will get started. And if you all have questions, just chime in. Hopefully I won't lose my little chat screen this time, but if I do and I can't see it, just go ahead and unmute and ask any questions you have. Feel free. Remember, your job is to slow me down where needed. So the first thing
sorry, Trisha, can I ask a question real quick?
Of course.
What do we need to know about the FAR? I mean, the FAR is like a pretty overreaching thing. When I started looking at it, I got kind of overwhelmed. So
yep.
Any help you can give.
Yeah, and we're going to go through some of what you'll need to know today, but basically with the FAR, it's going to be to know that it's applicable for federal contracts. You're not going to have to know, all of the clauses that pertain to, institutions of higher education. You might be, we will kind of talk about some best practices in contracting when we talk more specifically about contracting, and I might point out a couple of relevant clauses, but really just knowing that it's applicable to federal contracts.
Awesome. Thank you. I appreciate it.
Sure. Any other questions before we get started? Okay, I'm going to dive in. So I know right now you cannot see anything but my little blue screen, but give me just a moment to start the slideshow and then you shall see what you need to see. There you go. So everybody can see now. Okay, great. I'm going down here to the chat. Ooh, right now I have chat, so yay. Hopefully it will stay there and I can still see people and see the chat. Okay, great. Okay, so today we are going to actually finish up a little bit of proposal, not so much proposal development, but the things that we review and the things that we are required to review. So we'll talk a little bit about best practices, but I'm going to really emphasize federal requirements because we're talking about legal requirements today. I'm also going to talk just briefly about the review process on the agency side, how agencies review. We're not going to spend a lot of time, but again, there is federal guidance about agency review. So I'm going to not launch right into like uniform guidance in the FAR. We'll get to that. Instead, we're going to kind of finish out that proposal development review, merit review, what happens in that space of time from when we submit the proposal and then we sit there and wait and wait and wait, right? 6 months, 9 months, however many months before we get an award. So that's where we are headed today. And okay, so the part of the exam on legal requirements and sponsor interface covers the FAR, and so we're going to talk a little bit about that. We're even going to talk about what CFR, the Code of Federal Regulations, is, because you should be familiar with the Code of Federal Regulations. We're going to talk about some of the representations and certifications that we have to sign off on as we submit proposals. Under legal requirements are also your institutional committees for review of human subjects research and animal research and biosafety. We are going to cover that information actually in the compliance section. It just makes more sense again in my brain to kind of group compliance all together. Okay. We'll talk about the federal disclosures, particularly disclosures around conflict of interest and financial conflict of interest, and just a little bit about foreign engagement. Okay. HIPAA is also going to be covered under compliance, the Healthcare Information Portability something or other Act. Where am I getting the other P? Anyway, we'll cover that in compliance. And then we're also going to cover export control during compliance. So the focus today is going to be, again, on that space between proposal development and award, and then also on uniform guidance and FAR and Code of Federal Regulations. So that's where we are headed. And let's start with proposal review. Typical areas of proposal review are listed here and on the next slide. Again, just in general, being familiar with these areas of review, while at times there may be some best practice kind of questions on the exam, they have enough fodder from like, okay, here's federal regulation and you absolutely need to know this or need to know how to do this calculation, that you're not always getting a lot of best practice questions. But these, I think you should be familiar with the typical areas of review, and I'm not going to belabor them, but I am going to hit some of the ones that I know I've seen in the exam and also have some federal guidance behind them. So this, and then the next slide also shows some of the areas that we're going to hit and that you should be familiar with. Okay, so let's start with some program limitations. Okay. Programs can limit the number of proposals that may be submitted by an institution, okay? And this is something that's actually addressed on the exam because most institutions will have some type of limited submission process that they go through. So, for example, the National Endowment for Humanities, their summer stipend program is limited to the number of applicants. And so because of that, most institutions have some kind of limited submission program in place where they are reviewing proposals internally, and then they let the investigators know, oh, your proposal can go forward. Okay. At Colorado State, that process actually happens over in the Research Acceleration Office. Because if our institution is limited to 1 or 2 proposals total, we want to make sure that the proposal that we believe has the best chance of getting funded is the proposal that goes forward. Now, this is my 4th institution. All of the institutions, again, it's 4 out of hundreds and thousands of institutions, but of my 4 institutions, we always had a limited submission process, and many institutions do. I mean, the process could be first come, first serve. You let us know first, yours is going out. That's not really a really great way for an institution to operate, again, because they want to make sure that they have the best chance of going forward. Another limited submission program is the National Science Foundation MRI, Major Research Instrumentation Program, which limits the number of proposals and the type of proposals that can be submitted. And that limitation will change every year, so it's something we want to make sure we're checking the guidance. Last I recall, institutions could submit 3 proposals. 2 of them had to be in a certain track and 1 in another track. So again, we want to make sure we have the best chance possible going forward. Another limitation that an agency or a program might put on is the type of institution that can apply. So for example, the National Institutes of Health has a program called the AREA program. MRI is Major Research Instrumentation. Major Research Instrumentation, which I think I actually have that on the slide. Let me get there. There, MRI, Major Research Instrumentation Program. So the limit on the type of institution that can apply. The NIH, National Institutes of Health, has a program that they call the AREA program. And AREA, I'm trying to think of what that acronym's for, but their AREA program is limited to accredited institutions who receive less than $6 million per total cost in the last 4 of 7 years. Okay, so basically what this program does, it allows institutions that don't typically get a lot of NIH funding to apply to this pool of funding. The AREA awards are limited to 3 years, and they are limited to $300,000 direct cost total. Okay, so at Colorado State, because of the sheer volume of NIH research that we do and awards that we get, we are not eligible for AREA programs. This is the Research R03 program designation. So if ever you see a solicitation that says R03, you need to check that solicitation. You need to check to make sure your institution's actually eligible to apply. And when I first came to Colorado State, I had somebody from liberal arts reach out to me to ask for help submitting a proposal. Liberal arts doesn't do a whole lot of NIH grants, so they were unfamiliar. And the PI sent me the solicitation, and it was actually for an R03, which we are not eligible for at Colorado State. Now, we were when I was at Miami University, so that's how I knew about that. The nice thing is I was able to find a very similar solicitation from their R01, their major research program, that she was eligible for, that we as an institution, we were eligible for. So I had to just redirect her to the R01. I think there was actually even an R21, which is like a developmental exploratory program that we were eligible for. And then there's also small grant programs with the NIH that we're eligible for. So one, you should be familiar with the different kind of mechanisms on NIH. So, look those up if you are not familiar with NIH, but also know that there are limits that some programs put in place on types of institutions that can apply. So there is there's the acronym. Academic Research Enhancement Award is the AREA or R15 program. Okay. And then finally, a program might be limited, might limit the principal investigator by their stage of career, right? So for example, the National Science Foundation Early Career Program, the investigator must be an untenured assistant professor or equivalent. And they also cannot submit more than 3 times. It's kind of like 3 strikes and they're out. And they have a limited window in which they can submit. So, always it's important that we're double checking, is the PI eligible, and is the PI eligible depending upon if this program is for a certain stage in their career. And the NIH has certain career stage programs as well. I know American Chemical Society has certain career stage programs. So it's just always something that we want to be checking out. So any questions? Do you notice how I saw the one in the chat? I can see, I'm so excited. Okay. Okay. General R03s do not have an area limit. Okay. Yeah, the R15 does. Okay. Yeah. The R03 is the small grant program, and they don't have that limit. Yeah. Yeah. So the small grant program, the R03, and then the exploratory, the R21, both limit the dollar amount that you can apply for, but they don't limit the type of institution that can apply. It's only the R15 that has that 3-year, $300,000 limit. That limits the type of institution you can apply for. Thank you all for providing that additional information. Okay. And then there's that one about the early career program. Oh, I also mentioned the NIH area program because that limits the principal investigator as well. With that program, the PI cannot be on a current R01. They cannot have an R01 and an area, an R15 grant. So anything else that people want to add in there? Okay. Well, we're going to move into conflict of interest. We have quite a number of slides. I think deleted out like 5 of the slides that I felt like were duplicative from the last time. I'm going to step back and talk just a second about conflict of commitment. Sometimes people kind of muddle conflict of interest and conflict of commitment. Conflict of commitment, as institutions, we need to be concerned about both. I think where it comes to federal regulation and what you're going to see more in the exam is going to be around conflict of interest, particularly financial conflict of interest. When I think about a conflict of commitment, think of commitment as time. I think about 2 calendar invitations that are set for the same time. You can't do you can't accept both of those meetings and be at both of those meetings because you have a time conflict. Okay, that's what I think of when I think of conflict of commitment. So if an investigator, say, does a lot of work with their professional organization and they're gone so much and doing so much work, even if it's volunteer work for that organization, that they're not there to teach their classes or to attend their departmental meetings, that's a conflict of commitment, right? They're off doing other things, and that's actually impacting their time and their work at the university. And that's what we're usually talking about with conflict of commitment. Okay. With conflict of interest, this is where any interest outside of somebody's employment has an undue influence on their actions or their judgment. Okay, so it's not so much that time commitment as it is that they are, maybe involved in a political campaign and that's somehow impacting their work. But it's somehow that there's some kind of undue influence on their judgment. And typically the area that the federal agencies are most concerned with is when they're getting paid, right? And then that payment is really influencing the judgment. And so that's why some of the federal agencies have guidance around financial conflict of interest. So the one I think you really need to focus on for the exam is financial conflict of interest. So some federal agencies require federal disclosure of any kind of financial conflict of interest, significant financial interest, and I'm going to show you a definition of what that is in just a second, for not only for the investigator, but also for their spouse and dependents. So if they say hold stock in the company and that's somehow going to be a conflict with that award, the federal agency wants to know about it. That doesn't mean they can't go ahead and apply for the award or receive the award, but there might have to be some management that happens because of that potential conflict. So the federal agencies want to know what significant financial interests are out there that could potentially be conflicts. And I think the thing that hangs up our investigators the most is they're like, oh yeah, I have all this stuff going on. I have patents and I have stock in this and I have published a textbook and I'm getting royalties, but there's no conflict. Well, that's not really for them to decide. They still need to disclose all of that and let the institution and let the agency decide if they think there's a conflict. So disclosure for some of these agencies is actually required prior to even submitting the proposal. So NIH is one of them. And then I actually have a whole list, and no, you're not going to have to know the whole entire list. You also don't even have to know that significant financial interest is defined as 5,000 or greater. That used to be 3,000. It went up, I don't know, like 6 or 7 years ago. But again, remember, you don't have to remember thresholds for the purpose of the exam. Okay, does dependent use the same as taxes? Yeah, so any of your, yeah. Well, Emily, though, you like my dependents who are now over, 26 years of age or greater, I can't claim on my taxes, but they're still my dependent, right? And so they would still see them as your dependent. So any kind of immediate relation, whether that's spouse or children, adopted children. So let me give you the definition. I'm going to give you some time to kind of absorb this here, what they mean by significant financial interest. Okay. And I'm not going to read this to you. I'm going to just be quiet for a second and let you read. Okay, so the important things to know on this slide is, again, it applies to, spouses and dependents, and it's not just they're getting paid from another organization or agency. It's stock, it's equity interest, it's ownership interest, it's supporting their travel. So I do a lot of work for National Council of University Research Administrators, and when I was on the board, they didn't pay me. It was a volunteer position, but they paid for all of my travel. So whenever I traveled to DC or traveled, to be part of the board wherever we were meeting, they paid for my travel. So I actually have to disclose every year on my COI in CRA and the travel that they pay for me. So travel is the big one, I think, also. And at least at CSU, we specifically ask about travel. Is anybody paying for your travel? And along with all of this COI now comes all the foreign engagement stuff, right? They particularly want to know if a non-US entity is paying, an honorarium or paying for their travel. We have a couple of researchers here at CSU that have gone to China a few times, and the investigators in China paid for all of the travel. That's something that they need to disclose. So those are the kind of things that agencies are looking for. And again, sometimes that disclosure will come before the award. Sometimes it has to come before submission. And NIH is really the big one that says prior to even submitting, there has to be an active COI on file. So the things to really focus on here, besides understanding what we're talking about COI and financial COI, is that the conflicts must be disclosed, okay? Or potential conflicts must be disclosed, right? If a conflict is deemed to have occurred, then that conflict has to be managed. We have to have a management plan here at the institution. And institutions have to have written policies and procedures that comply with federal regulations around financial conflict of interest. So again, information has to be disclosed. Any conflicts should be managed by the institution, and that we have to have written policies and procedures. And the next slide will show investigator responsibility and institutional responsibilities around conflict of interest. Oops, sorry. Okay, so regulation. I said I was going to focus on regulation. The FCOI regulation is at 42 CFR Code of Federal Regulations, Part 50. And we're going to go a lot more into the CFR later in today's time together. But here, this is where you find FCOI regulation, which is promoting objectivity in research. And this applies to institutions as well as investigators. So that's another kind of first thing to know about FCOI regulations. They apply to both the investigator and the institution, okay? And it's not just for the principal investigator or the project director. It's for any key senior personnel. So anybody that's going to be involved in the conduct of the research, the design of the research, the reporting of the research results. So it's pretty comprehensive, again, to the institution and to key investigators that are involved in the research. So what do these regulations say? Again, they say institutions have to have policies and procedures and that they have to be posted and publicly available. Institutions must offer some kind of training. They don't dictate what training has to be offered, just that we should offer some kind of FCOI training, and that our investigators are completing the training and following the institutional policies and procedures. So again, the agencies aren't mandating what that training looks like. They just say, you have to have something in place, it has to be available, and you should be doing reasonable efforts to make sure your folks are getting trained, okay? Investigators must complete FCOI training prior to conducting their NIH research and every 4 years after that. Okay. And they should be submitting their significant financial interests for themselves and for their dependents and spouses. Okay, so the investigator, the responsibility of investigators to follow the institutional policies, to complete their training, okay, and to submit. So I've already mentioned all of this, okay. Again, disclosure should be no later than the first application for NIH funding. Okay. If they acquire a new significant financial interest, then they are required to disclose that interest. So let's say they get married and their spouse has ownership in the company, they need to disclose that. And that's probably a lot of what we miss. That stuff that falls in between the annual disclosure that our institution does. I'm not sure what other institutions on the call, if you all are doing this annually, most institutions do, but it's those things that happen in between time that we need to try to find a way to capture or encourage our investigators to disclose. But they should be disclosing at least annually. So what are we certifying to as an institution? Again, that we have an up-to-date written policy that's publicly available, okay? And we're trying to ensure that all of our investigators are in compliance with that policy. Okay. I think I have one other slide here. Again, if we do find out there is a conflict or if there's deemed to be a conflict, that we put a management plan in place, okay? And so we're taking steps to manage any conflicts that do come up. And then that we're certifying back to the federal agency that we are complying with the 42 CFR regulation. So, and then there's a lot that we're responsible for. Like I said, I literally had like 15 slides on this and I tried to cut them down. I've set this one aside as its own slide because we're going to talk about record retention later on. But I want to bring this up now and I'll try to repeat it and bring it up later. The record retention policy around FCOI is a minimum of 3 years. And you're going to see that a lot with the federal record retention policies. A lot of things are 3 years. Now, no, if you're at a state institution and your state record retention policy is longer than 3 years, which most states are, then you have to follow your state regulations. But the federal says at the minimum 3 years, or follow whatever your state guidance is if you're a state institution. Okay. Lots on FCOI. I actually took out the slides from your handout that had all of the agencies that adhere to the PHS FCOI regulation. I'm going to show them to you, not because you have to memorize them for the exam, but because you should be aware it's not just NIH. I think a lot of times when we think about financial conflict of interest, we think it's just NIH or PHS agencies like NIH and DHHS that follow this regulation. There are a lot more agencies, and agencies are constantly being added to this list. Okay, so current agencies that adhere to the Public Health Service FCOI regulation are listed here. Some of these fall under the umbrella of HHS and some don't. Okay. So you'll see some of these other. Okay, and this just goes on, and even some that you might not think about, like American Asthma Foundation, American Cancer Society, American Heart, American Lung, all of those follow that PHS regulation. And again, at Colorado State, we have on our compliance website, the RCRA website has all of these agencies listed on their COI page. And it just keeps going on and on. Okay. So no, you don't have to memorize them. That's why I didn't burden you with them in the handout, but I just wanted you to be aware it's not just NIH. Okay. So the major federal disclosure I think that you'll encounter on the exam is the FCOI, but know that foreign engagement is a large one. And I mentioned that one. If an investigator is receiving any kind of money or support for travel or support for their research from a foreign collaborator, they should be disclosing that to the agency in whatever way the agency says to disclose it. Oftentimes it's on the current and pending, or a form that's similar to the current and pending, or other support form if you're used to NIH jargon. Other federal disclosures, particularly that the institution has to disclose, research misconduct. If we find out that there's research misconduct going on at our institutions, we are required to report that. Any kind of mismanagement of funds, which in my mind falls under research misconduct. But if, we actually had this happen when I was at Western Kentucky. There was an investigator who had funding to support a volunteer organization. And she had a lot of students involved with that volunteer organization. And she wanted to provide pizza and t-shirts to the students. And the grant did not allow the purchase of pizza and t-shirts. So she falsified payroll documents to herself. And then she used the money to buy pizza and t-shirts. Okay. And this was on a very large federal Department of Justice of all grants, Department of Justice award, and she actually served time in federal prison and lost her tenured position because she wanted to buy some freaking pizza and t-shirts for students. Okay. She wasn't taking the money out and buying anything personal. It wasn't like she bought a boat or anything for it, but the falsification of the payroll documents and the mismanagement of funds is what landed her in federal prison. So it was really kind of a sad, very sad affair. And then also federal disclosures of sexual harassment. And this is one that I guess we've been seeing more and more of, like from National Science Foundation and National Institutes of Health, that if sexual harassment is known and that the PI or key personnel is engaged in that, and then we as an institution have a responsibility to report that to the federal agency. So that way they can make sure that they get proper oversight in place on these grants, on our awards. It doesn't mean they're going to yank our award, but it may mean that they take the PI off of that award or put them on probation. So that's another one that we are required to disclose. So any questions on, failure of judgment? It was really sad. She was a really excellent researcher and instructor, and it was career ending for her. So any questions on federal disclosure? There's actually, I can send this after because I'm just now remembering it. The National Institutes of Health has a really good video on FCOI. I would encourage you, if this is something that you're not familiar with and want to brush up on, to watch that video. So I will send that out after as a resource. Okay. State review, Executive Order 12372. What are we talking about here? We're talking about those programs that require an intergovernmental review, federal programs that require a review. Okay. Not all federal programs require review, and not all states participate in the intergovernmental review process. Okay. Again, this is an executive order, which means it comes out of the office of the president. It's a federal directive that there are certain types of programs, say like a construction program. NIH construction programs have to undergo this review to make sure that a state is coordinating all of its programs. So US Department of Education, their federal grants and financial assistance programs often fall under this executive order. Construction programs often fall under this order. If your state does not, there's usually a not applicable. There's usually like a box like the program isn't covered versus I can't remember the other box. There's ones like the program is, I don't know if it actually says not applicable. I'll have to go back and look because it's been a while since I've seen one of those, but it could be a combination of doesn't apply to this program or not applicable. But sometimes I think there are two boxes because again, some programs require it, others don't. And that's where you would say this program doesn't require it, or it's like not covered by, I think is the language, not covered under. If your state doesn't apply, then you would say like not covered under that area. I'm writing that one down. If anybody else knows, to write that in there. I don't think any states participating on this call today are actually require intergovernmental review. So again, I mentioned when I was in Kentucky, we were an EPSCoR state. We also participated in this executive order. We also participated in this coordination. So we had a single point of contact in the state. So SPOC is a new acronym for you. Single point of contact for review. So if we were applying to a program, and we did a lot of US Department of Education programs, and a lot of their programs require this review, we had to, at that time, now remember this is 20 some years ago, we had to submit like 11 paper copies to our state of the proposal for review. Okay, we were supposed to do it in the time frame that the state could come back and say yes or no if we could submit the proposal. Because what happened was at the time, if I was at University of Louisville and University of Kentucky was submitting a very similar proposal, they might say, Louisville, you can't go forward because Kentucky's already putting a similar proposal in. Did we ever get that information to the states in time? No. We submitted to the state about the same time we submitted the proposal. But what would happen is if the state came back, several weeks later and said you can't submit, then we would have to pull the proposal. In all of my years in Kentucky, and I was in Kentucky for quite a while, there was one time that happened, that we actually had to yank the proposal and pull it back because the state said no. So Emily, you have a question.
Yeah, so I might have missed something while I was taking notes or something, but it sounds like this is just a, I guess it says institutions within a state, if they are applying for certain kinds of things, might need to get that proposal reviewed by the state itself. And so the state has to acquiesce to them being able to submit it, basically.
Yep.
If they were a particular, do you know why this executive order was made? Because usually executive orders, there's something that causes them or something.
It's just to make sure that there was coordination of programs within a state. So that way, no one state was getting kind of all of the federal assistance versus another state.
Okay, so the review is not actually from the state itself then?
The review is from the state, but again, it's to make sure that the state is coordinating any of its applications, right? So again,
within the state?
I'm sorry?
Sorry, coordinating it within the state or with other states?
Within the state.
Okay.
Within the state. So we want to make sure that If there are 3 major research institutions in the state that they've kind of worked together and that we're pulling down, we're not trying to pull down all the federal funds for this program, but instead we're just pulling down one program that's going to benefit, hopefully everybody within that state.
Okay, so the mechanism
Yeah.
to prevent like a single state from getting an undue amount of the stuff is that ideally states will be limiting themselves.
Yes, exactly. Rather than having
Okay.
the federal government have to limit them. Yep.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, sure. Great question. And here I was trying to guess on the, the language, and here it's right here on the slide, but of course, I wasn't looking at the slide. So yes. So if the program doesn't require it, then you would select B. And as you all mentioned in the chat, if you are at an institution or within a state that doesn't participate in intergovernmental review, then you would select C. So all of us would probably be selecting C. And the states that participate in this review, again, you don't have to memorize all of these. So I don't think I included them in your handout, but looking at this, I didn't see Wyoming, I didn't see Colorado, I didn't see Pennsylvania or Massachusetts, I didn't see New Mexico. So some of you might not be familiar with this, which is why I thought it was important to talk about it, because you could see it on the exam. And you do see Kentucky's on there, and has been on there for a while. So it's something just to be aware of. And because some people, when they're checking the boxes that are here, have no idea what they're checking about because they've never encountered it in their state. That's what you're checking, is that your state is not participating. So here, so sorry, C, you would do that whether it's the program or your state not participating. Sometimes I never had a state, I never had Kentucky say, oh yeah, it's subject, but we're not going to look at it. We always had to submit copies if the program required it. So I suppose that could happen, and then you would choose B. Okay, and here typically we would just have to put in the date of when we submitted the information to the state to review. Okay, this was back before we were doing a lot through email, and we were actually still printing, sending in the copies. So usually that date pretty much matched the same date that we submitted the proposal, because you can't get things early from investigators. So, okay, so here, this one example that Liza put in there is it subject to review, yes or no? So the answer would be no if the program doesn't require it, or if you're in a state that doesn't participate. Okay. Other questions on that order? Okay. Certifications, representations, and assurances. And I have for contracts. Okay. Liza was trying to put an image to go with it in the chat, but the text was good, Liza, so thank you for that. Okay, so we're going to talk about the information, some of the information that's in sam.gov. And while the information is applicable to entities wanting to engage in federal contracts, okay, a lot of times they even be able to engage even in a grant program. And there are differences between cooperative agreements and grants and then contracts, right? We still have to have this information on file, because to do any kind of contractual work in a grant and a cooperative agreement is a type of is contractual work. So basically, to do business with the federal government, we have to have these assurances in place. Okay. But these representations and certifications are FAR requirements, Federal Acquisition Regulation requirements, that anybody wishing to apply for federal contracts must complete. And again, that extends to grants and cooperative agreements. If we want to do business with the federal government, we're going to have these on file. Okay. So these provisions require that the submitting entity to represent and to certify a variety of statements. And these statements range from environmental rules and compliance with different environmental rules to the size of your organization. There are literally pages and pages and pages of requirements that entities wanting to do work with the federal government have to go through, they have to read, they have to check if it applies to them or not, and they have to have these on file. And it's something that they have to do every year. And so the lucky person now at CSU that has to do this is Ashley Staley. But usually it's going to be somebody in either your grants office or your business and financial service office is going to have to go through and read through these statements and certify the statements. Certification is just that formal confirmation that we can comply with whatever that statement says. So for example, in sam.gov, we certify to the best of our knowledge that no federal appropriated funds have been used to pay for a lobbyist or have been used to influence any officials in the US government. So that's a statement that we have to read and check and certify. Again, these have to be updated annually, and it has to be done by your government point of contact. The GPC, the government point of contact. That's hopefully somebody that you know at your institution that is making sure that we do this annually. Before Dave Doty left, he's the one at CSU that used to do this, and now Ashley's the one that's responsible for this. Okay. I think last time I went in there, so you can actually go in sam.gov, put in your institutional tax ID number, and it will pull up your certs and reps. Anybody can look at these. I think there were 52 pages for CSU that had to be read through and information supplied, and then she had to check off on all of them. Okay. So a lot of times our upfront terms and conditions for doing work with the federal government, whether it's a grant, cooperative agreement, or contract, they basically say, by certifying that you have an annual update in SAM, you're agreeing to all of these terms and conditions. Okay. So what you need to know is that any entity doing work with the federal government has to annually update this information, and it's your government's point of contact that has to do this. Thank goodness we don't have to do this, right? Okay. Some typical ones that you should be familiar with. Again, out of the 52 pages, you don't have to memorize all of them, but the ones that I think that you should be aware of are the Lobbying Disclosure Act of 1995, the debarment suspension and other responsibilities, and then there are some agency-specific ones there that you should be familiar with. So let's start with Lobbying Disclosure Act of 1995. This basically says that we are certifying that no federal funds have been paid to or will be paid to any person in the federal government to try to influence them. So no employees, no officers of a federal agency, no member of Congress, so that we are not using federal money, okay, to do this. So one thing people look at, I think a lot of times on this disclosure form is, oh, that says we can't lobby. That's not what that says. It says we can't use federal money to lobby. Many institutions have lobbyists. They might not call them that. It might be their congressional liaison, right? They are paying somebody to go fight for them on Capitol Hill to direct money to their institution and to their programs and to their state. We do it all the time. What we are certifying here is that we're not using federal funds to do this. The other thing that we're disclosing on that lobbying form is, have we lobbied for funds for that program? Okay. So again, we haven't used federal funds, but have we lobbied? When I was in Kentucky, we did a lot of lobbying. There were a lot of programs that were directed to our institution because of that lobbying. And so I had to go through and fill out that form and actually say, yes, we hired a lobbyist to, go and fight for these funds. And that's how we are now applying for these funds. So that's what you're disclosing on that form, that standard form LLL. I don't know that we don't get nearly as many congressionally directed programs as we used to, like 20 years ago when I started. It seemed like every other program we got in Kentucky was because of a federal appropriation to our institution. I don't see those as much. So I'm really interested to hear people from Colorado State, also, New Mexico, Penn, Wisconsin, Massachusetts. We have all of us on here. Do you know if you all are still getting any federal appropriations directed because of lobbying, where you actually have to fill out that form LLL? Or do you have no idea?
I'm in the College of Ag,
Okay.
and we do receive some legislative funds.
Okay. And so you fill out that form and just say, yes,
Yes.
you've lobbied that. Okay. And Becky says, not that I'm aware of. And I always wondered, in that larger institution, how are you even aware? Like, at least you're aware there in your ag department that you've lobbied for those. I was a small enough institution that we knew which ones we were lobbying for. And it's really interesting because every year we rounded up faculty to submit white papers to give to our congressional liaison to take to Capitol Hill. And it was interesting because there was one program that we got a federal appropriation for. This investigator, she was a nurse, she had written like 2 or 3 pages of activities that she wanted them to lobby for. And before it was sent off, she added, just as like an afterthought, something about a mobile health unit on the last page. And it was the mobile health unit that some senator was like psyched up about. And all of a sudden we started getting all of this money for years and years and years to support mobile health units and mobile dental units to go out to rural areas in Kentucky and provide services to the rural areas. It was really kind of cool, especially because it was kind of an afterthought, something that she just threw in like maybe one paragraph about. But we actually established an autism center there at Western Kentucky as well because of a congressional appropriation. So, but you should be familiar with that act. And I can't remember if you need to know dates or not. I think Jeff Ritchie told me no on the dates. I will confirm with that. I always like to know dates, but I'm pretty sure he said no. I'll ask him about that. Okay, so debarment, suspension, and other responsibilities. That is where we have to certify that our institution and our investigators are not presently debarred or suspended, or even proposed for debarment or suspension to be able to enter into business with the federal government. Okay. So it's for our institution, it's also for our investigators that we're supposed to be checking to make sure that we are not debarred or suspended. That's why if we are submitting a proposal and we have a sub-recipient included, we're asking them, are you debarred and suspended? Because we need to know that if we're going to flow some of those federal funds down to that sub-recipient. Okay. Does that mean you can't submit the proposal? Not necessarily. It means you have to disclose that information. It means that there might have to be certain action plans put in place before you can receive the federal awards. But it's just like FCOI, we have to at least disclose it. Okay. And then some agencies may have additional certification that are not necessarily on file in SAM. And these are usually project specific. So there might be something in the reps and certs of a proposal that we're submitting that's outside the SAM, that's specific to a program. So we need to make sure that we're reading that information and that we are certifying that. And usually what the agency will say is at time of submission, if you submit this proposal, you are certifying these things. So you need to be reading that information. National Science Foundation is one, that when you submit the proposal, it says by submitting the proposal, you are certifying all of this information. So, oh, debarred is suspended from what? From doing work with the federal government. So that's exactly what they mean. There are some people because of, and I would imagine that PI that went to federal prison got debarred from doing work with the federal government future, right? So there are people, and sometimes it's temporary, sometimes it's permanent. It could be if somebody is like really lax on taxes that the government says, we are cutting you off. You cannot enter into a contract with the federal government. So it's basically declaring them ineligible for federal contracts. Okay. So we had Our Carmen Morales, who just retired, if you looked her up, she was actually on this debarred suspension list, but it wasn't our Carmen Morales. It was a different Carmen Morales. But we always had to, sometimes we would have federal sponsors come back to us and say, hey, it looks like Carmen Morales, signed on this, but how can she be signing? She's debarred and suspended. And we're like, okay, that's a different Carmen Morales. So it's actually just that they are suspended from doing work with the federal government. And our most of them, most people should be okay to enter into contractual agreements with the federal government, but sometimes we're surprised that there's something that for some reason they aren't. If an investigator has like a misconduct pending suit out there, they might temporarily be debarred from working with the federal government until that misconduct suit is resolved. Okay, so it's not always a financial thing, it could be a misconduct thing. So yes, barred is the default. Being able to is the default, unless there's an issue. Maybe our institution had a bad audit and we weren't responsive to that audit, so we could temporarily be debarred. Again, maybe an investigator is being investigated because of misconduct, or maybe something to do with foreign engagement, so they could temporarily be debarred. So we're supposed to really be checking that information before we submit. Somebody at your institution, typically the person signing, the signing official, and we're going to actually get to that here in the next slide, signing authorities in the next slide. But the two agency program or specific certifications that you should be aware of. First is the drug-free workplace, not workforce, that's a different act. The Drug-Free Workplace Act of 1988. This requires any federal contractors or grantees to agree that they will provide a drug-free workplace as a precondition of receiving the grant or contract. Okay, so drug-free workplace. So, CSU can say, yes, we're a drug-free workplace. We cannot agree to drug-free workforce. We have to be careful with industry contracts if it says drug-free workforce. Only if we were drug testing all of our employees on a regular basis could we comply with drug-free workforce. We don't do that at our institution. We can only comply with drug-free workplace. That's something that they might try to trip you up with on the exam. So be aware of that one. And then the other one is just non-discrimination in federally assisted programs. This is based on the Civil Rights Act of 1964. It basically says that nobody in the United States, based on race, color, national origin, can be excluded from participating in or receiving benefits from the federal government. Okay, and our institution complies with that act, and so we can certify to that. I would think most institutions do, particularly public institutions, or we wouldn't be in operation. Okay, and those are the big ones that you really should be aware of on the exam. Any other questions on those? Okay, so who is certifying? Again, you have a government point of contact that's certifying the information in SAM.gov, but when you're submitting a proposal, there's somebody that's also certifying, and typically it's the person at your institution that has the authority to submit the proposal and to sign. The authority, I should say, to sign, not necessarily to submit, because some agencies, one person might be able to submit but not sign, and then somebody else has to go in and sign. So it's whoever at your organization has the authority to sign the proposal and to sign off on all of those certifications. Okay, so signature authorities. It's your authorized organizational representative, AOR. And at large institutions, we have more than one AOR. We have a number of AORs here at Colorado State. All of our SRAs, senior research administrators, are AORs. Okay, they can submit proposals, they can sign the proposals and certify and that all of this information is true at the proposal stage. Okay, who assigns the roles? There's typically For electronic submissions, there's an eBiz point of contact who goes into the different federal systems that we submit through and assigns those AOR roles. So at our institution, that's Chris Karsten. She's our e-business point of contact. Okay. But basically, you should know that an AOR is somebody with the authority to submit proposals and or enter into agreements on behalf of your institution. Okay. And you might be familiar at least with that term, eBiz point of contact. That's the person that's going into the federal portals, federal submission systems, and we're going to look at some of those systems here in a minute, and is letting them know who at the institution is authorized as an AOR. Okay. This is just a page from CSU. You don't have to know this for the exam, but just in case people are wondering what the hell we're talking about, what the heck we're talking about. There are different lists. There's a list of people who can negotiate contracts. There's a list of people who are authorized to sign those certifications. There are a list of people who can sign contracts and award agreements, okay? And all of those people, and a list of people who can sign proposals. Those lists vary, and they always have to be maintained, and they should be publicly available, or you should at least be able to get your hands on them to send them to a sponsor. And we have had sponsors, usually non-federal sponsors, who ask to see those lists, who want to be assured that that person that's signing has the authority to sign. Since I've been at CSU, we've had agencies ask, and at other institutions, I've had agencies ask. Right now, they are out of date. So don't go looking at this information on our page. I'm meeting with Grant Calhoun, who's now an OSP and was also with legal counsel, to make sure we get these lists up to date. Because we've had a lot of turnover in our sponsored research office lately. So we're working on getting this information up to date. Okay, any questions on certifications or on who has authority to sign for the certifications? Okay, we're going to move in then to some of the ERA systems that you should be familiar with, again, for the exam. You don't have to know every single federal portal. I've mentioned before that the exam is NIH and NSF heavy, so you should be familiar with those two portals. For the National Science Foundation, it is Fastlane and research.gov, because they're still transitioning to research.gov. Okay. For the NIH, it's ASSIST, the Application Submission System and Interface for Submission Tracking, long ass acronym, but no, it's ASSIST. And then they also have some other portals for submitting just-in-time information. I'm going to talk in a minute about what I mean by that, okay? And also for the progress reporting, the RPPR system. And we'll talk more about reporting later when we talk about federal reporting. Okay. So the ones you should really be familiar with, grants.gov, I mentioned that last time. Grants.gov is not only a place where we can find about federal opportunities, but we can actually submit through the grants.gov workspace. Okay. Workspace has been around enough that you probably don't need to know about the legacy PDF packages for the purpose of the exam, but you should be familiar with Workspace. And that Workspace is grants.gov's portal for submitting to the other federal agency portals. It does that interface between the institution and federal agency portals that receive applications. I already mentioned Fastlane and research.gov. These are used for not only proposal submission, but proposal review. So the reviewers actually can get into Fastlane and research.gov and review the proposals there. And then once awarded, to do some project management, we can use research.gov to do the project management piece. Okay. ERA, I already talked, or sorry, NIH is ERA, Electronic Research Administration Suite, I already talked about. Okay. Another one I thought you might be familiar with for the purpose of the exam, or the other two, would be the Easy Fed Grants, which is USDA's portal. Again, that allows for proposal submission and management, award management, okay? And then also NASA's Inspires. You see the acronym at the bottom, Inspires. That's also a very comprehensive portal for the preparation and submission. So know that grants.gov is only for proposal submission Grants.gov is not for proposal management. Okay. And grants.gov basically provides that interface. It goes through grants.gov, it gets a check, and then it goes to the sponsors portal where it gets checked again. So something might get through grants.gov and look okay, but it hits a wall at that sponsor portal and bounces back because there's an error. Okay. That's only for submission. And then the different sponsors, a lot of them, their portals you can use more than just for submitting. You can use to submit and to do project management. Anybody want to chime in anything there? Either questions or information that you want to add to that? It's hard to fathom. Yeah, well, it was done with great big libraries. So my first job in research administration was to open the mail and pull out all the federal funding opportunities and say, hey, I think psychology might be interested in this. Go put it on the photocopier, make 20 some copies of it, and then put it in campus mail to the psychology department. And then go get campus mail and get a copy of their proposal and make 25 copies, and then go to FedEx and send it to the National Institutes of Health. That was like my job when I first got into research administration. Okay, merit review. I want to just briefly talk about merit review process. You might get a question. Yeah, Easy Fed Grant is not easy. It's anything but. It's totally a lie in its name. Merit review process, you should know something about how proposals are reviewed. At the very least, you should know that the federal government for federal programs says that proposals should go through a competitive process in which they are scored or rated based upon their scientific merit. So I put a reference up here on the slide, that 2 CFR 200.204. Okay, that's a uniform guidance reference, and we're going to get into uniform guidance in a minute. Sorry, I know we're running out of time too, but that's fine. We have some catch-up time. So in here, uniform guidance says a couple things about merit review. It says that the federal agencies have to have a process in place. That process should be transparent to the public. Right? So an investigator should know what criteria they are being judged and how that process happens. Okay, that doesn't mean that they get to be privy to the process. It's not like the investigator gets to sit in the room, but they should know what they're being reviewed on. And that information actually has to be included in the program solicitation. Okay, so most programs will go through a merit review process. Some may not. Again, the federal agency has to say what programs don't go through merit review. Some of the supplemental programs might bypass merit review, and the project program officer can make the decision on those. They don't go through a whole review process. Okay. So again, for the purpose of the exam, know that there has to be a review process in place, and it has to be transparent. The federal agency has to list someplace on their website or in their solicitation the review criteria. So you know, well, you may know if you work with National Science Foundation, there are 2 major review criteria for NSF, right? Broader impacts and scientific merit. Where for the NIH, they have a handful of review criteria. So every federal agency is going to have different review criteria. And then the agencies get together reviewers and make up panels of reviewers to review the proposals. And back last time when I talked about the letter of intent, the whole purpose of the letter of intent is to make sure they have appropriate people on their review panels for the type of applications that they may receive based on those letters. Okay, and then the federal agencies have to provide outcome information to the investigator. Again, they won't say who reviewed the proposal, but they do have to provide general comments back to the investigator on kind of basically, like, they usually will say what was good about the proposal and then, you know, where the proposal fell short. Okay. The other thing to understand about the review process is it's not always the highest ranked or the highest scored proposal that necessarily gets funded. So it's not just the review that determines funding. Okay. There might be a time where a proposal that's scored or ranked lower gets selected for funding because maybe it fits better with other programs that are being funded. Because what happens is these federal agencies usually have these large questions that they're trying to answer. And it could be that a proposal that didn't score as well is going to be a better fit for answering that question, okay, rather than one that scored better. So they take that into account. They take in, some agencies take in geographical location. So if they see that a lot of their funding is going out to schools out on the West Coast, and they don't have any programs in place on the East Coast or maybe in the center of the US, they might spread their funding. So again, it's not the one that scored higher, it's the one, look, we have this empty space here right in the middle of our map, and we want this program to be funded there. So there's a lot of information that goes into the ultimate funding decision, not just the review. And I have a couple of really good videos if you're interested in the review process. I didn't include them in homework because I don't think you'll need to know it for the purpose of the exam, and that's the whole purpose of this group. But I'll send it to you as just a little FYI if you're interested. Okay. And I think that's all I want to say about the review process. Are there any questions on that? I should say that for this is basic, the review process applies to assistance awards, grants and cooperative agreements. Funding decisions for contracts may use a merit system. They may just look at proposed costs and what the lowest bid wins, or they could use a combination of the two. So, but the guidance, that federal guidance I gave you, the 200.204, applies to grants and cooperative agreements, applies to assistance programs. Okay, review of risk. This is something else that's in uniform guidance. And again, I gave you the 200.205. Okay. Federal agencies have to have a framework for evaluating risk. How do they do that? They ask us if we are debarred and suspended, or if our investigators are debarred and suspended. They look back. Have we had a bad audit? Do we have, an audit resolution in place? Are we risky to send federal money to? And then they put the burden on us. If we're going to flow that money down to a subrecipient, we should be reviewing the risk of that subrecipient. Again, they don't dictate how we do it. They just say we need to have some process in place for reviewing subrecipient risk. So basically, the federal government saying anybody they send money to needs to be evaluated for risk. And they put that burden for evaluating our subs on us, which makes sense. Okay. The framework for evaluating what the federal government does to evaluate us must be described in the funding opportunity announcement. By and large, it comes in making sure we're registered in SAM and making sure we have our certifications in place. So, is it different for grants and for contracts? Yeah, so this information is actually for assistance awards. So anything that you see that has a uniform guidance reference applies to assistance awards. Yep. But again, to do work with the federal government, whether it's a grant or a contract, we have to have the SAM certification in place. Okay. Okay, just in time. I mentioned just in time information. Oh, goodness gracious. There's so much information here. Okay, so just in time information. This is information that goes to the sponsor after a proposal has been submitted. So post-submission information. Okay. Some of this information, some of the federal agencies have elected to not require this information at time of submission, but rather wait until they're ready to make an award. The reason why they do that is because funding rates are so low, right? They can be on the order of 10%. So that's a lot of applications that aren't funded. So why request all this information up front? It's just undue administrative burden. So instead, they're like, you can wait and submit this information just in time for an award to be made. That's where the term just in time comes from. Okay. So I gave some examples of some of this just in time information. Sometimes it can be compliance for human subjects or animal subjects. Okay. No, this pertains to federal agencies. I have worked with non-federal agencies that want this information at time of submission. So always make sure you're reading the guidance to see when they want it. But typically for federal programs, you don't have to have your compliance, your regulatory compliance for animals, for biosafety, for humans in place until they are ready to make an award. And the agency won't make the award typically until that compliance is in place. Okay. Other support. So all of the investigators, wherever they're receiving support for their research, this is where we're seeing a lot of scrutiny on foreign engagement to make sure if they're receiving research support for their labs and their research and their travel, that that's listed in their other support documents. Some agencies vary on this. If you work with National Science Foundation, this information is required in the proposal. It's required in the current and pending document. If you work with NIH, this information is a just-in-time information, the other support document. So that can still vary agency by agency. Any budget modifications? So if the agency comes back and says, congratulations, you're awarded, but we're only giving you half the funding that you asked for, you might then be requested to give them a budget modification. So they know that you're going to have to reduce the budget, maybe even reduce the scope of work. So they might request a budget modification. Okay. And then the small business subcontracting plan I'm going to talk about on the next slide. Know that this post-submission information is information that the agency is requiring. There's also post-submission information that an investigator may send to an agency prior to the review process. So that's not information that's required, but it might be something that the PI wants to send. And there are processes at every agency on what information can be sent prior to review and how it should be sent. Okay, so for an example, let's say an investigator submits to the National Institutes of Health, and after they submit the proposal, but before that proposal is reviewed, they get a major publication accepted in a journal. You know, they get it approved to publish. They probably want the reviewers to know that they got this publication. So that would be an example of post-submission information that's not required by the agency, but is submitted by an investigator. And there are definite rules and regulations around what can be submitted and when. Maybe they got a patent and they want the agency to know about that patent and they want the reviewers to know about that. Every agency will have its list of what can be submitted and how it should be submitted. So that's a little bit different than this just-in-time information. The just-in-time information is information that's required by the agency prior to making an award. Do you all understand the difference there? Okay, I see some heads nodding. Okay, so the small business subcontracting plan. Wow, we still have a lot of slides to go. I'm just looking at the time. Okay, so this applies to federal contracts, not assistance, but contracts. And again, you don't have to know this amount will change, but the aggregate amount of contracts that exceed a certain threshold. Right now, the threshold is $700,000 in total cost. So that's your indirect and your direct costs. Okay. What's required for these large contracts, and so let's say somebody gets a contract for $500,000, but then all of a sudden they start getting all these modifications. As soon as they get pushed over that threshold, whatever the threshold is, they have to submit that small business subcontracting plan. What they do is they will work with the procurement office, typically it's procurement office at most institutions, to set certain goals, dollar amount goals, that they are going to try to send some of those federal dollars to small businesses, to historically underutilized businesses, to women-owned businesses, to minority-owned businesses. Oh, it's $750. Thank you, Shannon. See, I told you that amount changes all the time. So I'll update that slide. Okay. So there's a whole list. If you've ever heard the terms, and I've always heard it called meeby-weeby. I can't remember how Chris Carson says it. She says it like Mibby-Wibby or something like that. If you ever heard the meeby-weeby, they're talking about minority-owned businesses and women-owned businesses. That's what we're talking about here, that certain portion of those funds, a percentage, should be directed to those type of businesses. So the investigator has to have a plan in place for contracting with those type of entities. And that's something that procurement is well versed in and can help your investigators with. But it does have to be in place when you have those federal contracts exceeding a certain dollar threshold, which is now $750K. Okay. Is the plan binding? Absolutely. So every year CSU does not meet their ratios, and every year we have to pay money back and we get slapped on the hand because we don't meet this. So yeah, it is. And there are ramifications for not meeting your goals. So that's why it's important that our investigators are working with procurement to try to set realistic goals. But even at that, it's very difficult sometimes to meet those goals. And then we get fines from the federal government. Sometimes we don't meet the goals, Emily, because one, just the number of businesses around the area to be able to work with. That could be one that you just don't, particularly if the investigator has very specific needs. So let's say, they're purchasing some equipment or a service, but they have very specific equipment needs because this equipment has to work with other equipment, and they can't get it from one of these small businesses. They have to go with a larger business. So that would be a case where they can't direct that money for services or for purchases to one of these type, I'm just going to say the meeby weeby type of things. So thank you, Kim, for letting me know. So, but there are a host of reasons. Sometimes we can't get the small businesses to actually self-identify as, basically the small businesses have to have this designation, and procurement works with a lot of businesses in the areas to try to get them to do this designation, but many don't want to fool with it. They simply just don't want to fool with it. And so, yeah, it can be. So we can go offline on some of this. So, okay, regulatory framework. Let's see what we can get through in 10 minutes. Not a whole lot, but that's okay. Code of Federal Regulations, CFR. So this is codification of rules and regulations, right? And codification, when I first got in there, it's like, wow, this stuff is codified. It means it's listed, right? It's a listing. It's basically a listing of rules and regulations and all of these requirements from the executive departments and the federal award agencies in the US federal government. So the CFR is divided up into topical areas. We call those titles. So you should be familiar with titles. Okay, and then each chapter contains regulations, by that title. It is published annually. And where is it published? It's published in the Federal Register. The Federal Register is the official journal of the federal government. It has all of the agency rules, all the proposed rules, all the public notices about all the federal assistance programs. It's published every day of the week, except for, it's published weekdays, not on weekends, weekdays, except for federal holidays. So if there's a federal holiday on a Monday, the Federal Register doesn't come out. And back when I showed you sam.gov's site, there's a link there to the Federal Register on sam.gov. So Code of Federal Regulations is published annually in the Federal Register. And so let's hear for just our last few minutes, and we'll end here, and then we'll pick this back up next week. Open up a browser if you're at the computer, and go to the, let me go to the next page. Go here. Go to this gov.ecfr, which is Electronic Code of Federal Regulations. Okay. .io there. See if you can get that to open. Let me go back up. Yeah. Okay. I'm trying to see which one I want you to go to. Go to 45, so title 45, and then CFR 46. Okay. So 45 CFR 46. And if somebody is able to get that information, yeah, so you hear the reference to CFR because that's where uniform guidance lives. It lives in Title 2, CFR, and then starting at 200. So Title 2 is grants and agreements. Part 200 is where you find uniform administrative requirements, your cost principles, and your audit requirements, which is uniform guidance. So that's the part of CFR, the Code of Federal Regulations, where uniform guidance lives. Okay, so 2 CFR 200. Okay, how about 45 CFR 46? What lives there? Can anybody tell me what Title 45 is from that website? If anybody
Welfare?
is. I'm sorry?
Public welfare?
Public welfare, that's right, public welfare. Can you dig down then into part 46?
Protection of human subjects.
Protection of human subjects, exactly. So write that on your line there, protection of human subjects. If you know any references for the exam from the Code of Federal Regulations, these are the 3 that you need to know. You should know that uniform guidance lives in Title II, Part 200. So grants and agreements, and then Part 200 is uniform guidance. 45 is your public welfare, and 46 is the protection of human subjects. So 45, this is also known as the common rule. If you hear people say the common rule, this is what they're talking about. They're talking about 45 CFR 46. I would be familiar with this reference, and it's actually fun to read. I love going, this is, you know, the geeky thing. I like to go in CFR and type in these and start reading some of this stuff. It's really great information. The other one that you should be familiar, and somebody at the very beginning asked, what should you know about the FAR? You should know that the FAR lives in the CFR, and it lives under Title 48. Which are the federal acquisitions regulations. And it's part 1 through, I think it even extends on beyond 51 now. Do you have to know all those parts? No. You know, should you know that it lives at 48 CFR? Yes, you should know that. Okay. What are your thoughts? We are at 125. Should we take a breather and stop here, or should we move into how federal regulations happen? I see a couple. Let's just go through this one, and then we'll stop right before we get to uniform guidance. Just real quick, this reminds me back of, you know, how a bill becomes a law, kind of. We need to go back to some of those fun ones, but how the federal regulations happen. You should know a little bit about this. I do remember some of this being on the exam, and I do know that they cover this in the CRA review session. Okay, so creating federal regulations is known as the rulemaking process. Okay, so the first thing that happens is US Congress passes a law that is designed to address some kind of social need or economic need, right? But then a regulatory agency has to come in and create regulations in order to implement that law. So the law is passed, but an agency has to create regulations to implement that law. Okay. Some agencies may even create what they call sub-regulations, but we're not going to worry about sub-regulations. What you should be familiar with on the exam is the Office of Management and Budget. Office of Management and Budget, or OMB, is the largest office within the executive office of the president. They're the ones that prepare the president's budget. Okay. And it is this agency that evaluates agency programs, agency policies, procedures, you know, all of that information around grants and contracts. So it used to be that uniform guidance, instead of uniform guidance, we had all of these OMB circulars that came out that talked about the regulations behind these different federal programs. So it's OMB, that's that regulatory agency for the federal award programs. So again, knowing that Congress passes a law, but you have to have regulatory agencies or some type of authority to come in to tell us then how to implement that law. So for grants and cooperative agreements, it is OMB, Office of Management and Budget. For contracts, it's FAR. Okay. So we will be going through, it's the FAR councils, and we will be going through both uniform guidance set by OMB and then the FAR regulations set by the FAR councils. So the two regulatory agencies to know are OMB, Office of Management and Budget for grants and contracts. FAR council is the regulatory agency for federal contracts. Is that good? Okay. Okay. Oh, and then I go throwing in the Freedom of Information Act. I can't even remember why I put it in there, but you should know about the Freedom of Information. I mean, I didn't know why I put it in at this time. I know that you need to know about it, but I can't remember my thinking way back when I made these slides or why I put it in here. Freedom of Information Act, or FOIA. Okay. Since the 1960s, the Freedom of Information Act has basically provided transparency and given the public rights to request access to records from any of the federal agencies. Okay. So the federal agencies are required to disclose information that's requested through a FOIA request. They can make some exemptions in order to protect personal identities and to protect personal privacies, or if it's a national security issue. So what happens is they'll redact that information and then send that information from the FOIA request. So what used to happen back in the day is when, say somebody got funding from the National Science Foundation, that MRI program, and somebody else, another investigator, wanted to see a copy of that proposal, they would submit a FOIA act to NSF saying, I want a copy of that proposal. And NSF had to, under FOIA, give them a copy of the proposal. Now, what NSF could do is they could block out the name of the investigators, they could block out the name of the institution the award went to, they could block out any salary information, but they had to send the core of the proposal to that investigator. That still happens today. A lot of times though, we make those requests of each other. I call up Wyoming and go, hey, I saw you all were funded in this program, would you be willing to share? The cruddy thing is if they're like, no, my PI really doesn't want to share, I'm like, okay, I'm going to send you a FOIA request. So you have to do this. Well, actually, Wyoming, I probably wouldn't send it to them. I would probably send it to the agency that funded the proposal. But we try first to just kind of be nice to each other and say, would you mind sharing? Because the FOIA request can take quite a while to get that information back. But you should be familiar with FOIA for the purposes of the exam. And then we are at our time. And so we will go through uniform guidance that comes from OMB, the regulatory agencies for grants and contracts. And then we'll go through federal acquisition regulations that comes from the FAR Council and applies to federal contracts. In the next time. I actually thought all that earlier material we would just breeze through, but I'm glad you all had questions and we will have time to get through everything. So it's a lot. It's a lot you got to be familiar with. Are we good?
Tricia, can I ask a question?
Yes.
Are we going to have to, and maybe this is something for the uniform guidance portion of this, but are we going to have to be able to tell what old circulars are now mapped to uniform guidance?
No longer. Thank goodness. When I took it, I had to, and I did confirm with Jeff that you do not have to map
Okay,
A21 and A133 and what subparts they go to.
Okay, great. Thank
Good
you.
question though. But yeah, I mean, still being familiar with that, at least OMB is the one that is the regulatory agency. Yeah. So, okay. Other questions? Great. Okay. Well, yay. Sorry, we're a minute over and we'll get together next week. I'll check about the date thing. I'm pretty sure Jeff said you don't have to know dates, but I thought I remember having to know dates. So I'm going to double check that information and let you know. Okay. Okay. Have a good rest of the day. Bye.